In the hallowed stone-cold silence of Westminster Abbey, where the kings and queens of England sleep beneath marble effigies, a crime was committed. It was not a crime of theft, nor of violence in the physical sense, but rather a violent act of erasure. The date was 1814. The Napoleonic Wars, which had consumed a generation of young men and turned the continent of Europe into a charnel house, were reaching their fevered, bloody crescendo. But here, in the Henry VII Lady Chapel, far removed from the roar of cannon fire and the salt spray of the Atlantic, a small group of officials gathered to perform a duty that had no precedent in the history of the British Empire. They carried with them the tools of a tradesman, a ladder, a screwdriver, perhaps a hammer. They moved with a grim, bureaucratic efficiency, their footsteps echoing off the vaulted fan ceiling, a masterpiece of medieval architecture that seemed to look down in judgment upon the proceedings. They approached the stall assigned to one of the nation's greatest living heroes. Above the wooden seat hung the banner of a knight companion of the most honorable order of the Bath. It was a symbol of supreme chivalry, a recognition that the man who held it had bled, fought, and risked everything for the crown. The name on the brass plate was Thomas Cochrane. The officials climbed the ladder. With unceremonious haste, they unhinged the banner. They unscrewed the brass plate that bore his name and his family crest, but simply removing these items was not enough. The sentence passed down by the establishment demanded total degradation. Once the banner was lowered, it was not folded neatly or placed in a box. It was cast to the floor. And then, in a moment of theatrical cruelty that seems almost medieval to modern sensibilities, the banner was kicked. It was kicked down the stone steps of the chapel, tumbling through the dust, treated like the refuse of a traitor. This was the kicking out of a knight. It was a humiliation designed to shatter a man's soul. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must understand the man whose honor was being trampled into the Abbey floor. Thomas Cochrane was not merely a captain in the Royal Navy. He was a phenomenon. He was the man Napoleon Bonaparte himself had dubbed Le Loup des Mers, the sea wolf. He was a tactical genius who had turned the tides of impossible battles, a commander who could capture a Spanish frigate with a crew half the size of the enemy's, a visionary who saw the future of warfare when his superiors were still looking at the past. He was the inspiration for the naval fiction of centuries to come, the real-life flesh and blood behind the stories of Jack Aubrey and Horatio Hornblower. And yet, in 1814, the British government did not celebrate him. They sought to destroy him. While his banner was being defiled in Westminster, Cochrane himself was rotting in the King's Bench prison. He had been stripped of his knighthood, expelled from the House of Commons, and removed from the Navy list. He had been sentenced to the pillory, a medieval punishment where a man was chained in a public square to be pelted with rotten vegetables and filth by the mob. It was a sentence so draconian, so vindictive, that even the hardened public of Georgian London recoiled in horror. The government, fearing a riot, had been forced to cancel the pillorying, but the message was clear. The establishment wanted Thomas Cochrane dead, not physically executed perhaps, but socially, politically, and professionally annihilated. How had it come to this? How had the greatest sailor since Nelson, the man who should have been leading the fleet to final victory, ended up a convict and a pariah? The tragedy of Thomas Cochrane is not a simple story of a hero who fell from grace. It is a darker, more complex narrative about the friction between genius and mediocrity. Cochrane was a man born into the wrong century, or perhaps the wrong system. He was a radical thinker in an age of rigid tradition. He was a man who believed that merit should outweigh birthright, that innovation was superior to custom, and that the truth, no matter how ugly, was more important than the reputation of powerful men. In the eyes of the Admiralty, that sluggish, barnacle-encrusted institution that ran the Royal Navy, Cochrane's victories at sea were almost less important than his insolence on land. He had committed the cardinal sin of the Georgian era. He had embarrassed his superiors. He had pointed out their corruption. He had mocked their incompetence. And he had refused to play the game of patronage and sycophancy that greased the wheels of the empire. The kicking of his banner was not justice, it was revenge. As we stand in the shadows of Westminster Abbey, watching that banner tumble down the steps in our mind's eye, we are witnessing the climax of a secret war. While the British Army fought the French on the fields of Spain and the Navy blockaded the ports of Europe, a different war was being fought in the drawing rooms of London and the boardrooms of the Admiralty. It was a war between the old world and the new, between the entrenched aristocracy and the rising tide of meritocracy. Cochrane was the casualty of that internal conflict. But the men who kicked that banner down the steps made a critical miscalculation. They believed that by stripping Cochrane of his titles, they could strip him of his legacy. They believed that by painting him as a fraud and a criminal, they could erase the memory of his deeds. They were wrong. You cannot court-martial courage. You cannot imprison genius. The story of Thomas Cochrane is one of the most extraordinary odysseys in British history. It is a tale of high adventure on the high seas, of smoke-choked decks and splintering timber, of boarding parties and desperate midnight raids. But it is also a story of the King's Bench prison, of political intrigue, of a man forced to flee his own country and lend his sword to foreign revolutions in South America and Greece just to survive. It is the story of a man who fought 40 battles and won them all, only to lose the peace. To understand the depth of his fall in 1814, we must first understand the dizzying heights from which he tumbled. We must go back to a time when the world was ablaze, when the shadow of the Corsican ogre, Napoleon, lengthened across the English Channel, and when the survival of Britain hung by the thinnest of threads. We must go back to the moment when a young, penniless Scot walked onto the deck of a tiny, insignificant ship and decided that he would conquer the world. The dust settles in Westminster Abbey, the banner lies on the floor, the officials turn and leave, satisfied that they have extinguished a star, but the story does not end in the dark of the chapel. In fact, the story of the Sea Wolf is only just beginning. What led to this moment was a lifetime of defiance. What followed was a lifetime of redemption. This is the story of the admiral who fought 1,000 enemies on the ocean, only to find that his most dangerous foes were the men sitting in the plush leather chairs of Whitehall. This is the story of the impossible odds faced by a forgotten genius. And to tell it properly, we must leave the silence of the Abbey and step into the roar of the past, to a time when the fate of the free world depended on wood, canvas, and the iron will of a single difficult man. To understand the precipice upon which Britain stood at the turn of the 19th century, one must look not at a map of the world, but at a map of Europe painted almost entirely in French blue. By the year 1800, the old order of the continent had been shattered, ground into dust under the boots of the Grande Armée. Monarchies that had stood for centuries were dissolving like sugar in hot tea. From the coast of Portugal to the plains of Italy, the shadow of the Corsican ogre, Napoleon Bonaparte, was lengthening with terrifying speed. Britain was alone. The great coalitions of Europe had crumbled. The Austrians had been beaten into submission, the Prussians humiliated, the Russians neutralized. There was no ally left to call upon, no distraction to draw the French gaze away from the white cliffs of Dover. The Channel, that narrow strip of grey, turbulent water, was no longer just a geographic feature. It was the only thing preventing the tricolour flag from flying over the Tower of London. And patrolling that moat, standing between liberty and tyranny, were the wooden walls of England, the Royal Navy. From a distance, the Navy projected an image of invincibility. It was a glorious machine, a forest of masts and canvas that had dominated the oceans for generations. To the average Briton, the Navy was a sacred institution, commanded by demigods like Nelson, protected by the providence of the Almighty. It was the shield that never fractured, the sword that never dulled. But if you stepped closer, if you looked past the fresh paint and the polished brass, if you walked the corridors of power in Whitehall rather than the quarterdecks of the fleet, you would find a very different reality. You would find an institution that was rotting from the inside out. The Royal Navy of the early 1800s was a paradox. At sea, it was crewed by the toughest, most skilled sailors the world had ever seen, men who could reef a topsail in a gale and fire 3 broadsides in 5 minutes. But on land, it was managed by a bureaucracy so ossified, so corrupt, and so paralyzed by tradition that it threatened to sink the nation faster than any French cannonball. This was the age of old corruption. It was a time when a man's rise in the service depended less on his ability to read a chart or command a crew, and more on whom his father dined with. It was the era of interest. If you were a young officer with dreams of command, it did not matter if you had the tactical genius of Alexander the Great. If you did not have a patron, a lord, an admiral, or a member of parliament to speak for you, you would rot on half-pay for the rest of your life. The Admiralty Board, the supreme governing body of the Navy, was not filled with young visionaries eager to modernize the fleet to face the Napoleonic threat. It was largely a retirement home for the well-connected. These were men who fought wars with quill pens and ledgers, men who viewed innovation with deep suspicion. To them, the Navy was perfect as it was. They believed that what had worked in the 1750s would work in the 1800s. They viewed the aggressive, scientific approach to warfare favored by the French not as a threat to be countered, but as a vulgarity to be ignored. This stagnation created a dangerous disconnect. While Napoleon was revolutionizing warfare on land, creating a meritocratic army where a baker's son could become a Marshal of France based solely on his talent, the British Navy was doubling down on aristocracy. They wanted captains who were gentlemen first and warriors second. They wanted safe pairs of hands. They wanted officers who would follow the fighting instructions, a rigid, outdated set of tactical rules, to the letter, even if following those rules led to defeat. The result was a command structure that was terrified of risk. There were exceptions, of course, men like Nelson and Collingwood, but the rank and file of the senior leadership were cautious to the point of paralysis. They hoarded supplies, they delayed orders, and they prioritized the protection of their own careers over the destruction of the enemy. They were lions led by donkeys, and the donkeys were sitting in comfortable offices in London, debating the price of biscuit flour while the world burned. But the crisis facing Britain was not just one of leadership, it was one of arithmetic. The mathematics of war were turning against the island nation. Napoleon, with the resources of half of Europe at his disposal, was embarking on a massive shipbuilding program. The French shipyards were working day and night. Ships were sliding down the slipways in Brest, in Toulon, in Rochefort, and in the captured ports of the Netherlands and Spain. The strategic nightmare for the British Admiralty was simple. They were running out of ships, and they were running out of men. The Royal Navy had to be everywhere at once. They had to blockade the French ports, protect the merchant convoys from the West Indies, patrol the Indian Ocean, and guard the coast of Ireland. The fleet was stretched so thin that it was translucent. Ships were staying at sea for years at a time, their hulls fouling with barnacles, their rigging rotting in the sun, their crews decimated by scurvy and typhus. The Admiralty knew that they could not win a war of attrition. If it came down to a simple contest of numbers, France would eventually win. They would build more ships, cast more guns, and levy more men. The wooden walls were strong, but they were brittle. One catastrophic defeat, one storm that scattered the blockade, and the invasion barges gathering in Boulogne would cross the channel. Britain did not need more conventional captains. It did not need more men who could follow orders and sail in a straight line. It needed a miracle. It needed a new kind of officer. It needed men who could do more with less. It needed commanders who could take a single, rotting frigate and terrorize an entire coastline. It needed tacticians who were willing to throw the rulebook into the sea and invent a new way of fighting, a form of asymmetric warfare that relied on speed, deception, and psychological terror rather than brute force. The tragedy and the irony was that the Admiralty was actively suppressing the very men who could save them. The system was designed to weed out the mavericks, the eccentrics, and the radicals. It was designed to produce obedience, not brilliance. This was the world into which our protagonists stepped. It was a world of high stakes and low politics, a world where a captain could be a hero to his men and a villain to his masters. It was a world that was desperate for a savior, yet perfectly designed to destroy him. As the 19th century dawned, the atmosphere in the naval ports of Portsmouth and Plymouth was thick with anxiety. The press gangs roamed the streets, dragging men from taverns and merchant ships to fill the empty hammocks of the fleet. The dockyards rang with the sound of hammers, but there was a sense that it was not enough. The horizon was dark, the storm was coming. And in the midst of this gathering gloom, a young Scotsman was looking for a ship. He was not rich. He had no great political patron to smooth his path. He had a famous name, but his family estate had been sold off to pay debts. He was abrasive, he was opinionated, and he possessed a terrifying intelligence that made lesser men uncomfortable. By all the rules of the Admiralty, he should have been ignored. He should have been left on the beach. But the war was desperate, and sometimes, when the devil is at the door, you have no choice but to hire a wolf to fight him. Into this stagnant world of gold braid and grey thinking stepped a man who seemed to have been constructed from entirely different materials. Thomas Cochrane, the future 10th Earl of Dundonald, was a living contradiction. He was a lord, yet he was poor. He was an aristocrat, born into one of the oldest families in Scotland, but his inheritance consisted not of vast estates and overflowing coffers, but of a crumbling castle and a legacy of eccentricity. His father, a brilliant but disastrous inventor, had liquidated the family fortune to fund scientific experiments that produced everything from coal tar to smokeless furnaces, ideas that were decades ahead of their time, but financially ruinous in the present. Young Thomas inherited this dangerous cocktail of traits: a restless, scientific mind, a desperate need for money, and a complete inability to accept the status quo. He did not enter the Navy as a child midshipman at the age of 12, as was the custom. He joined late, at 17, a man among boys, already hardened by the harsh realities of genteel poverty. He rose through the ranks not by bowing to superiors, but by outworking and outthinking them. But in the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy, brilliance was often mistaken for insubordination. So when the Admiralty finally gave him his first command in 1800, it was not a sleek frigate or a powerful ship of the line. It was a joke. It was a vessel intended to humble him, a command so insignificant that it felt like a calculated insult. They gave him HMS Speedy. To call the Speedy a warship was to stretch the definition of the word to its absolute breaking point. She was a brig sloop of 14 guns, but describing her stats fails to capture the sheer absurdity of her physical reality. She was tiny, her deck was crowded, her lines were tub-like, and her interior dimensions were fit for a dollhouse, not a fighting crew. The space between the decks was only 5 feet high. Cochrane himself stood well over 6 feet tall. This meant that the commander of the vessel could not stand upright in his own cabin. When he needed to shave in the morning, he had to remove the skylight and use the upper deck as a table, his head protruding through the floor of the quarterdeck like a conjurer's trick, much to the amusement of his crew. And then there were the weapons. The Speedy was armed with 4-pounders. In the lexicon of naval artillery, these were derisively known as pop guns. A standard frigate fired balls weighing 18 or 24 pounds, capable of smashing through 2 feet of solid oak. A 4-pound ball was little larger than a croquet ball. Cochrane, upon taking command, was so disgusted by his armament that he walked onto the deck with a handful of the cannonballs in his coat pocket, joking that he could carry a broadside's worth of ammunition on his person. He requested 6-pounders, but the Admiralty refused, citing that the ship's timbers were too weak to handle the recoil. This was the weapon the British Empire had given Thomas Cochrane to fight the French, a claustrophobic, undergunned, slow-sailing coffin. A lesser man would have spent his time writing letters of complaint, hugging the coast, and avoiding trouble. A lesser man would have seen the Speedy as a prison. Cochrane saw her as a laboratory. He realized immediately that he could not fight the war the Admiralty wanted him to fight. He could not stand toe-to-toe with enemy ships and trade broadsides. The Speedy would be splintered into matchwood in minutes. If he was to survive, and more importantly, if he was to make his fortune in prize money, he had to rewrite the rules of engagement. He had to turn his weakness into a weapon. He started with the ship itself. If the Speedy could not be powerful, she had to be efficient. He drilled his crew relentlessly, not just in the mechanical loading of guns, but in the art of improvisation. He realized that the Speedy's small size made her hard to hit, a gnat buzzing around a bull. He overloaded her with canvas, carrying spars and sails meant for a much larger ship, risking a capsize to squeeze every knot of speed out of the hull. But his greatest weapon was deception. Cochrane understood the psychology of the sea. He knew that ships at a distance were identified by their silhouette and their paint. He obtained a Danish quartermaster, a man with a genuine Danish uniform, and had the Speedy painted in the style of a Danish merchant brig. In the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean, neutral ships were often left alone. The ruse was brilliant in its theatricality. When a powerful enemy frigate would spot the Speedy and close in to investigate, Cochrane would hoist the Danish flag. As the enemy drew nearer, he would send his Danish quartermaster to the rail to shout in his native tongue, complaining about the weather or the price of cargo. If the enemy was still suspicious and attempted to board, Cochrane had a final, terrifying card to play. He would hoist the yellow quarantine flag. In the era before antibiotics, the plague was a terror far greater than any cannon. The yellow flag signaled that there was sickness on board, cholera, typhus, or the plague itself. At the sight of that yellow square of fabric flapping in the breeze, the blood would drain from the faces of the enemy boarding party. They would veer away instantly, terrified of breathing the same air as the infected merchant ship. Cochrane would watch them flee, doubtless with a wolfish grin, having defeated a superior enemy without firing a shot. This was the genesis of the Cochrane method. It was warfare as performance art. It was the understanding that confusion and fear were force multipliers. Slowly, the Speedy began to rack up a tally of victories that defied logic. They captured merchant vessels, privateers, and gunboats. The pop guns, when fired at point-blank range into the rigging or sterns of enemy ships, proved surprisingly effective. The crew, initially skeptical of their strange, lanky captain who shaved through the roof, began to adore him. They were earning prize money hand over fist. They walked the streets of Port Mahon in Minorca with pockets full of gold, boasting that they served under the maddest, luckiest captain in the fleet. But Cochrane was not satisfied with picking off stragglers. His ambition was growing. He was testing the limits of what was possible, pushing the Speedy into deeper and more dangerous waters. He was prowling the coast of Spain, a single brig terrorizing an entire nation's shipping lanes. The Spanish naval authorities were becoming apoplectic. They dispatched frigates specifically to hunt him down. They put a price on his head. They wanted the little wolf destroyed. Cochrane knew they were coming, and in his heart he welcomed it. The Speedy was no longer just a ship. It was an extension of his will. He had taken a vessel that the Admiralty regarded as useless and turned it into the most efficient predator in the Mediterranean. But the true test was yet to come. The ruses and the tricks had worked on merchantmen and privateers, but soon the Speedy would find herself under the guns of a true warship, a leviathan that could blow her out of the water with a single sneeze. The stage was being set for one of the most ludicrously lopsided battles in naval history. The scientist captain had built his machine. Now he had to see if it would hold together in the fire. The forgotten man was about to make the world remember his name. On the 6th of May, 1801, the Mediterranean Sea was calm, the sky a brilliant, indifferent blue. Off the coast of Barcelona, the HMS Speedy was doing what she did best, prowling. She was a wolf looking for a stray sheep, but on this particular morning, the wolf walked into a cage. The sail that appeared on the horizon was not a merchant ship. As the Speedy drew closer, the stranger did not turn and run. Instead, she altered course, turning her bow directly toward the little British brig. As she heeled over in the wind, the gun ports opened like the eyes of a waking dragon. One row, then another. She was a frigate, and not just any frigate. She was the El Gamo, a 32-gun xebec frigate of the Spanish Navy. The trap had been sprung. The Spanish had tired of Cochrane's insolence, of his raiding and his mockery. They had sent a leviathan to swat a fly. To understand the terrifying arithmetic of this moment, we must look at the ledger of death. The El Gamo carried over 300 men. The Speedy had 54. The El Gamo fired a broadside of nearly 200 pounds of iron. The Speedy could barely manage 28. If the Spanish captain, Don Francisco de Torres, simply sailed alongside the Speedy and fired a single rolling broadside, the British ship would not just be defeated, she would be erased. She would be turned into driftwood and red mist. The crew of the Speedy looked to their commander. In any sane navy, the order would be to surrender. Honor had been satisfied. No one expected a sloop to fight a frigate. To fight was suicide. To fight was madness. Thomas Cochrane looked at the towering hull of the enemy, then he looked at his men and he smiled. He did not see a death sentence. He saw a geometry problem. He ordered the crew to prepare for action, but he gave them specific, peculiar instructions. They were not to fire a shot until he gave the signal. They were to load the guns with treble shot, 3 balls in every cannon, and most importantly, he took the helm himself. Cochrane knew that at long range he was dead. His only safety, paradoxically, lay in the shadow of the monster. He had to get close, dangerously, insanely close. The El Garmo fired. A thunderclap rolled across the water, and a storm of iron tore up the sea around the Speedy. But Cochrane did not flinch. He steered the little brig straight into the teeth of the fire. He watched the Spanish gunners reloading, calculating the seconds. He waited until the very last moment, until the hull of the frigate loomed over him like a cliff face, and then he ran the Speedy right alongside her. It was a maneuver of breathtaking precision. Cochrane brought his ship so close that the yardarms of the Speedy actually locked into the rigging of the El Garmo. The 2 ships were handcuffed together. And then the physics of the battle shifted. The Speedy was so low in the water, and the El Garmo so high that the Spanish guns were useless. Their cannonballs whistled harmlessly over the heads of the British sailors, tearing through the sails but missing the deck entirely. The Spanish gunners, in a panic, tried to depress their muzzles, but the gun carriages hit the sills of the ports. They could not aim low enough. They were a giant who could not reach the dwarf standing between his feet. But Cochrane could reach them. He gave the order to fire. The Speedy's little 4-pounders, elevated to point upward, erupted. Treble-shotted, pointed directly up through the main deck of the Spaniard. The effect was horrific. The first broadside smashed up through the timber, sending a shower of splinters and shrapnel into the packed masses of the Spanish crew. It was a slaughterhouse. For an hour, this bizarre dance continued. The El Garmo was a floating fortress, unable to defend itself against the pest clinging to its flank. The Spanish captain, realizing his guns were useless, gave the order to board. He had 300 men. He would simply overwhelm the British by sheer weight of numbers. Cochrane saw the Spanish gathering at the rails, ready to jump. He knew his 50 men would be hacked to pieces in close combat, so he pulled the Speedy away, just a few yards, breaking the connection. The Spanish faltered, unable to jump the gap. Cochrane then raked them with another volley of grape and round shot, clearing the rails, before smashing the Speedy back against the frigate's side. He did this twice. It was tactical brilliance, but it was exhausting. Cochrane knew that eventually the Spanish would succeed. They were regrouping for a massive rush. The Speedy had taken damage, her rigging was shredded, her men were tired. The stalemate could not hold. Cochrane turned to his crew and told them the truth. "We must board them," he said, "or we must die." It was a command that defied logic. 50 men were going to attack 300, but Cochrane had one final piece of psychological theater to perform. He ordered his men to smear their faces with candle grease and gunpowder soot. He wanted them to look like demons. He wanted them to look like creatures dredged up from the bottom of hell. Leaving the ship's surgeon, Mr. Guthrie, alone at the wheel to steer the ship, literally the only man left on board, Cochrane led his screaming, blackened crew over the rail and onto the deck of the El Garmo. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a Spanish conscript. You have been pounded from below by invisible guns for an hour. Your officers are shouting, the smoke is blinding, and suddenly, out of the smog, a horde of black-faced fiends bursts onto your deck, hacking with cutlasses and screaming like banshees. Cochrane did not attack the main group. He ordered his men to attack the bow and the stern simultaneously, creating the illusion of a much larger force. In the chaos, the Spanish captain, Don Francisco, was killed, struck down by a musket ball. The leaderless crew wavered. Then, in a moment of supreme audacity, Cochrane played his ace. He noticed the Spanish colors were still flying. Fighting his way to the quarterdeck, he looked back at the Spanish crew and shouted instructions to his own men, instructions to a reserve force that did not exist. He pointed back to the empty Speedy and bellowed for another 50 men to board. The Spanish, believing they were about to be swamped by a second wave of British Marines, broke. Their morale, already battered by the eerie nature of the battle, shattered completely. A Spanish officer, seeing the futility of it, lowered his sword. He looked at Cochrane, this tall, soot-stained madman, and surrendered the ship. The silence that followed must have been deafening. The smoke cleared to reveal the absurdity of the situation. On the blood-slicked deck of the El Garmo, 48 British sailors, 6 had died, stood guard over nearly 300 surviving Spanish prisoners. The prisoners sat in sullen rows, their weapons stacked. It was only then, as the adrenaline faded, that the Spanish realized what had happened. They looked at their captors, few in number, exhausted, and realized they had been beaten not by force, but by fear. When Cochrane accepted the sword of the Spanish second-in-command, the officer looked at him with a mixture of hatred and awe. He asked Cochrane for a certificate ensuring he had done his duty, for he knew no court-martial would believe that a 32-gun frigate had surrendered to a brig. Cochrane, with the grace of a gentleman, granted it. The voyage back to Port Mahon was a tense affair. The British crew had to remain awake for days, guns trained on the prisoners, knowing that if the Spanish realized just how few guards there were, they could retake the ship in an instant. But the El Garmo sailed into harbor under the Union Jack. The sight of the tiny Speedy towing the massive El Garmo into port became the talk of the Mediterranean. It was the ultimate underdog victory, a triumph of skill over brute strength. Napoleon himself, upon hearing the news in Paris, reportedly shook his head and muttered, "Cochrane, the sea wolf." But while the Navy cheered, the Admiralty in London remained silent. There were no parades, there was no immediate promotion. Lord St. Vincent, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was reportedly irritated by the victory. It was too flashy, it was too unconventional, it embarrassed the establishment. A man who won battles like this was dangerous because he proved that the old ways were obsolete. Cochrane had performed a miracle, but in doing so, he had committed the one sin the bureaucracy could not forgive. He had made them look unnecessary. The victory over the El Garmo should have made his career. Instead, it marked the beginning of the end of his acceptance in polite society. He had proven he was a genius, and for that, he would have to be destroyed. The war at sea was going well, but the war at home was about to begin. Victory in the Royal Navy was supposed to be a currency. You spent blood and courage, and in return you bought promotion, prize money, and the gratitude of your country. By the laws of this exchange, Thomas Cochrane should have been the wealthiest, most celebrated captain in England. He had delivered the El Garmo, a prize that defied the laws of probability, into the lap of the Admiralty. He waited for the applause. He waited for the promotion of his brave first lieutenant, Lieutenant Parker, who had been severely wounded leading the boarding party. He waited in vain. The silence from London was not an oversight, it was a policy. Lord St. Vincent, the First Lord of the Admiralty, was a man of iron discipline and rigid hierarchy. He viewed Cochrane not as a hero, but as a disruptive element. When Cochrane wrote to St. Vincent, politely requesting the promotion of Lieutenant Parker, the reply he received was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. St. Vincent wrote that the battle against the El Garmo, while successful, could not be considered a feat of significant daring, because the casualties on board the Speedy had been so low. It was a statement of breathtaking callousness. The Admiralty was effectively penalizing Cochrane for his skill. Because he had maneuvered so brilliantly that his men were safe, his victory was deemed worthless. At that moment, something in Thomas Cochrane snapped. A more political man would have swallowed the insult and waited. A more cunning man would have flattered St. Vincent until he got his way. But Cochrane was a fiery Scot with a pathological inability to tolerate injustice. He wrote back to the First Lord of the Admiralty. In a letter that should have been written in fire, he pointed out that his casualties were low because of his tactics, while in St. Vincent's own famous victory at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, the casualties had been high, implying that the First Lord was a butcher who measured glory in dead sailors. It was a letter of suicide. With a few strokes of a quill, Cochrane had torpedoed his own career more effectively than any French cannon ever could. He was immediately sent to the naval wilderness. He was given the Arab, a ship so slow and unseaworthy that it was known in the fleet as the Collier. He was sent to patrol the fishing grounds off the Orkney Islands, a task fit for a disgraced midshipman, not the hero of the Mediterranean. He was literally being exiled to the ends of the earth. But the Admiralty had made a grave error. They had assumed that by removing Cochrane from the sea, they rendered him harmless. They did not realize that they had merely forced him to open a second front. If he could not fight the French with cannon, he would fight the Admiralty with words. In 1806, Thomas Cochrane stood for Parliament. He entered the House of Commons not as a politician, but as an avenging angel. He had seen the rot inside the wooden walls, and he was determined to expose it. He sat as the member for Honiton, and later for the militant constituency of Westminster. His arrival in the chamber was like a grenade rolling down the aisle. He had no patience for the gentlemanly debates of the aristocracy. He spoke with the raw, booming projection of a man used to shouting over gales. He attacked the rotten boroughs, the corrupt election system that allowed rich men to buy seats, but his real target was the naval administration. He began to pull at the loose threads of the Admiralty's tapestry. He demanded to know why sailors were being fed biscuit that was more weevil than flour. He demanded to know why men wounded in service of the king were left to starve in the streets, while Admiralty clerks grew fat on skimming contracts. He produced lists, terrifying, undeniable lists of sinecures. These were salaries paid to men who did no work. He exposed that the Admiralty was paying pensions to the wives and children of admirals for jobs that didn't exist, stealing money directly from the wages of the common seamen. He stood on the floor of the House and read out the names of the corrupt, shaming the government day after day. The public loved him. To the mob in London, he was our Tom, the hero who fought for the little man against the giant machine. But inside the halls of power, he was becoming something far worse than a nuisance. He was becoming a threat to the stability of the government. The Tories looked at Cochrane and saw a radical, a Jacobin, a man who would tear down the very institutions of the state in his quest for justice. They had to stop him, but they couldn't arrest him. He was too popular. They couldn't bribe him. He was incorruptible. They needed a way to silence him that looked like an honor. In 1809, a crisis emerged that offered the perfect solution. A massive French fleet had gathered in the Basque Roads, a sheltered bay on the Atlantic coast of France. They were preparing to break out and attack the British colonies in the West Indies. The British blockade was holding, but only just. The situation required a bold strike. The Admiralty summoned Cochrane. They offered him command of a special mission to destroy the French fleet. It was a glittering opportunity, the kind of command every officer dreamed of, but it was also a trap. The trap lay not in the mission, but in the command structure. Cochrane would not be in supreme command. He would be leading the attack, but he would be answerable to the commander-in-chief of the Channel Fleet, and that commander was Admiral Lord Gambier. If Thomas Cochrane was the embodiment of the romantic hero, dashing, brave, and reckless, Lord Gambier was his polar opposite. Gambier was an evangelical Methodist who distributed religious tracts to his crews and forbade swearing on his decks. He was known in the fleet as Dismal Jimmy. He was a man who believed that war was a regrettable necessity, best conducted with extreme caution. He detested risk, and more importantly, he detested Thomas Cochrane. The Admiralty knew exactly what they were doing. They were mixing oil and water. They were sending the most aggressive captain in the Navy to serve under the most passive admiral in the fleet. If Cochrane refused the mission, he would look like a coward. If he accepted, he would be placed under the thumb of a man who would likely stifle his plans. If Cochrane failed, his reputation would be ruined and his political voice silenced. If he died in the attempt, well, that would solve the government's problem entirely. Cochrane saw the trap. He tried to refuse. He told the Second Lord of the Admiralty that his appointment would cause jealousy among the senior captains already at the blockade. He argued that he was a member of Parliament and was needed in London. But the Admiralty insisted. They played on his vanity and his patriotism. They told him he was the only man in the Navy with the genius to burn the French fleet. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, Cochrane accepted. He boarded the HMS Impérieuse and set sail for the Bay of Biscay. He left behind the shouting matches of the House of Commons for the cold reality of the Atlantic. He was sailing toward his destiny, but he was also sailing toward a betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the Impérieuse cut through the grey swells, heading south toward the enemy, Cochrane began to sketch designs for a new kind of weapon. He knew that conventional tactics would not work against the French defenses. He needed something terrifying. He needed something apocalyptic. He was going to turn the Basque Roads into a sea of fire. But as he plotted the destruction of the French, he should have been looking over his shoulder. For the true danger was not the batteries on the French shore, but the flagship of his own admiral waiting for him in the fog. When the Imperieuse finally dropped anchor in the churning grey waters of the Bay of Biscay in April 1809, Thomas Cochrane did not find a fleet preparing for battle. He found a fleet preparing for tea. The British blockading squadron, a collection of the finest ships of the line in the Royal Navy, sat idly on the swell, miles distant from the enemy. There was no sense of urgency, no sharpening of cutlasses or running out of guns. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of lethargy, presided over by the towering flagship of Admiral Lord Gambier, the Caledonia. Cochrane's arrival was akin to throwing a fox into a kennel of sleeping hounds. He was 33 years old, a junior captain with a reputation for recklessness and radical politics. The captains already present, men who had spent bleak, freezing months staring at the French coast, viewed him with undisguised hostility. To them, his appointment was a professional insult. Why had the Admiralty sent this lord, this parliamentary rabble-rouser, to do a job that any of them could have done? The wardrooms of the fleet buzzed with jealousy. They called him a glory hunter. They wished him to fail. But Cochrane had no time for the petty squabbles of the mess hall. He turned his telescope toward the French. What he saw would have daunted a lesser man, but to Cochrane, it looked like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The geography of the Basque Roads was a nightmare for an attacker. It was a narrow, treacherous anchorage tucked behind the Isle d'Aix. Inside this natural fortress lay the French fleet, 11 massive ships of the line, 4 frigates, and a host of smaller vessels. They were the invasion force that Britain feared, but they were currently acting as a fortress. The French admiral, Alemand, was no fool. He knew the British were outside, and he had turned the anchorage into a trap. He had arranged his ships in 2 curved lines, their broadsides facing the entrance, creating a kill box where any approaching British ship would be subjected to the concentrated fire of over 700 guns. But his masterstroke was the boom. Stretching across the channel, moored with heavy anchors and chains, was a colossal floating barricade. It was a monster of engineering, huge logs bound together with iron chains, cables, and spars. It was nearly a mile long. Its purpose was simple: to stop any British fireship dead in its water, leaving it to burn harmlessly while the French gunners picked off the attackers at their leisure. Behind this boom, and under the protection of the heavy shore batteries on the Isle d'Aix, which bristled with mortars and long guns, the French fleet felt untouchable. They were safe inside a cage of their own making. Admiral Gambier looked at this defensive layout and saw an impossibility. He wrote to the Admiralty that the enemy position was sacred, a strange choice of word, perhaps revealing his religious fatalism. He believed that any attack would be suicidal. He was content to sit outside, maintain the blockade, and pray that the French would eventually make a mistake. He was a man who believed in providence, but he lacked the imagination to help it along. Cochrane looked at the same scene and saw something entirely different. He did not look at the guns, he looked at the water. He saw that the tide in the Basque Roads ran hard and fast, sweeping directly inward from the sea toward the French anchorage. He saw that the prevailing wind was blowing from the northwest, pushing directly into the face of the enemy. The elements were aligned. The geometry of the battlefield favored the attacker, provided the attacker was willing to dispense with the rules of civilized warfare. Cochrane went to Gambier's cabin on the Caledonia. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. The admiral, elderly, pious, and cautious, surrounded by hymn books, and the captain, young, vibrant, and dangerous, his mind racing with chemical formulas and blast radiuses. Cochrane proposed a plan that was shocking in its violence. He would not send in standard fire ships, those old vessels smeared with tar that drifted aimlessly. He would build explosion vessels. These would be floating bombs, packed with thousands of barrels of gunpowder and hundreds of shells, designed not just to burn, but to detonate with the force of a volcanic eruption. The plan was to drift these infernal machines into the boom on the flood tide. The explosion would shatter the barrier and terrify the French. In the ensuing panic, the standard fireships would follow, driving the French vessels onto the rocks. Gambier listened with a look of distaste. To a man of his generation, this was not war, it was terrorism. It was ungentlemanly. It lacked the clean, honorable lines of a fleet engagement. But Gambier also knew that the Admiralty demanded action. If he refused Cochrane's plan and the French escaped, his career would be over. Reluctantly, with the air of Pontius Pilate washing his hands, Gambier gave his consent, but he attached a caveat. He would not risk the fleet. Cochrane could have his explosion ships, and he could have a handful of volunteers, but the main strength of the British Navy would remain anchored miles away, safe from the shore batteries. Cochrane would be going in alone. For the next few days, the Imperieuse became a factory of death. Cochrane worked like a man possessed. He requisitioned transport ships and began to modify them. He personally supervised the loading of the gunpowder. He had puncheons, massive casks, staved in and filled with powder. On top of this powder, he laid a floor of logs, and on top of the logs, he piled thousands of hand grenades and rockets. He was building the largest bomb the world had ever seen. The tension in the fleet was palpable. The sailors knew that something terrible was being prepared. The French knew it too. From their decks, they could see the frantic activity around the Imperieuse. They knew the Sea Wolf was up to something, and a creeping dread began to spread through the French crews. They stopped sleeping. They doubled the watches. They stared into the darkness, waiting for a spark. On the afternoon of April 11th, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind began to howl, whipping the tops off the waves. A gale was rising, a fierce northerly storm that would turn the sea into a cauldron. To Gambier, the storm was a reason to delay. To Cochrane, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The wind was blowing directly at the French. It would drive his explosion ships forward with terrifying speed. Cochrane signaled the flagship, "The wind is fair, we must attack tonight." Gambier hesitated. He looked at the whitecaps, he looked at the shore batteries, and he looked at his comfortable cabin. But he could not say no. The order was given. As night fell, the Basque Roads became a black void, the darkness absolute. Cochrane boarded the leading explosion ship. He sent the crew away, keeping only a lieutenant and 4 men with him. He wanted no unnecessary lives risked. They sat on top of 1,500 barrels of gunpowder, drifting silently into the storm, heading toward the greatest concentration of naval firepower on Earth. The stalemate was over, the trap was set, but as Cochrane lit the slow match and checked his watch, he knew that the fuse he was lighting would do more than just destroy the French fleet. It would ignite a chain of events that would consume his own career. The impossible odds had been calculated. Now the dice were thrown. The sun had vanished, swallowed by a wall of bruised slate-gray clouds that rolled in from the Atlantic. The wind, which had been a stiff breeze in the afternoon, was now screaming through the rigging, whipping the tops of the waves into a chaotic froth of white water. It was the kind of night where sensible sailors double-lashed the guns and prayed for dawn. But on the heaving deck of a transport ship that had been stripped of its name and its soul, Thomas Cochrane was preparing to violate every instinct of self-preservation known to man. He stood on the deck of what he called an explosion vessel. To the Admiralty, this was a disposable asset. To the French, it was a mystery. But to Cochrane, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a machine designed with the cold, mathematical precision of a scientist intent on creating hell on Earth. The construction of this vessel had been a macabre labor of love. Cochrane had not simply piled gunpowder into the hold. He had designed a shaped charge, a concept a century ahead of its time. He had taken 1,500 barrels of gunpowder, enough to level a small town, and bound them together into a solid mass using heavy cables. He had packed wet sand between the casks to ensure the force of the explosion was directed not outward, but upward and forward, like the blast from a blunderbuss. But the powder was only the propellant. The payload was far more sinister. On top of this bed of explosives, Cochrane had laid a floor of solid logs, and upon that floor, he had stacked nearly 3,000 hand grenades and hundreds of 8-inch mortar shells. The entire ship was essentially a giant, floating shotgun shell pointed directly at the heart of the French fleet. The air on deck tasted of salt and imminent violence. The ship groaned under the stress of the gale, its timbers creaking in protest against the weight of the death it carried. Cochrane moved with a calm, deliberate energy, checking the fuses, inspecting the portfires. He was dressed not in the gold-laced finery of a captain, but in a rough pea-coat, his face set in a mask of concentration. He had ordered the majority of the crew to leave. This was a mission for volunteers only, and even then, he restricted the number. He would not spend a single life more than necessary. 4 seamen and a young lieutenant, William Bissell, remained with him, 6 men on a floating volcano. Around them, the water was black as ink. The rest of the fire ships, standard vessels filled with brushwood and tar, were tossing in the swell behind them, manned by nervous crews who looked to Cochrane's vessel as their guide. Far in the distance, miles upwind, the anchor lights of Lord Gambier's fleet twinkled like indifferent stars. They were spectators at the Colosseum, safe and warm, waiting for the show to begin. But ahead, in the throat of the Basque Roads, lay the enemy. The French were not asleep. Admiral Alemand had his crews at quarters. He knew something was coming. The wind was blowing straight into the anchorage and the tide was flooding fast. It was the perfect vector for an attack. He had strengthened the great boom, that mile-long chain of logs and spars, hoping it would act as a shield. But Alemand was thinking in terms of fire. He expected burning ships to drift against the boom and sizzle out harmlessly. He did not understand the nature of the thing that was currently surfing down the waves toward him. He did not know that Cochrane had engineered the apocalypse. "Cast off," Cochrane said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind. The final cables were slipped. The explosion vessel, caught by the gale and the rushing tide, surged forward. It felt less like sailing and more like falling. The ship was unsteered, a dead weight hurtling through the dark. Cochrane stood by the fuse. This was the point of no return. The plan relied on timing so precise it bordered on insanity. If the vessel exploded too early, it would be a spectacular firework display that did no damage. If it exploded too late, Cochrane and his men would be atomized along with it. He had calculated the burn rate of the fuses carefully. 15 minutes. That was the window. 15 minutes to light the match, scramble into the small gig, a rowing boat towed astern, and row against a gale-force wind to get out of the blast radius. It was a race against physics. The wooden boom loomed somewhere in the darkness ahead, invisible but felt. Cochrane waited until they were almost upon the outer markers of the channel. He looked at Lieutenant Bissell. The young man's face was pale in the gloom, but his eyes were steady. "Now," Cochrane said. He touched the linstock to the portfire. The fuse hissed into life, a serpentine spark racing toward the hold. "Into the boat, move." The transition from the ominous stillness of the preparation to the frantic desperation of the escape was instant. The men scrambled over the gunwale and dropped into the gig, bobbing violently in the wake of the bomb ship. Cochrane was the last to leave. He dropped into the stern sheets and grabbed the tiller. "Give way, pull for your lives." The 4 seamen drove their oars into the water, but the sea fought back. The wind that was driving the explosion vessel toward the French was driving the gig back toward the bomb. They were rowing into the teeth of a gale. The waves lifted the small boat and slammed it down, spray lashing their faces. Every stroke was a battle. They pulled until their muscles screamed, their lungs burning with the cold air. They watched the silhouette of the death ship receding into the gloom, a dark shape drifting relentlessly toward the enemy. The fuse was burning. Tick, tick, tick. Suddenly, Cochrane realized something that made his blood run cold. In the rush of preparation, a mistake had been made. The fuses they had used were not the 15-minute slow burners he had ordered. They were shorter, much shorter. They did not have 15 minutes. They had less than 10, perhaps less than 5. "Pull," Cochrane roared, his voice cracking over the wind. "Harder." The men, sensing the urgency in their captain's voice, redoubled their efforts. They were fighting to put distance between themselves and a force that could shatter oak ribs like matchsticks. The gig crested a wave, and for a moment they hung suspended in the dark, looking back at the vessel they had abandoned. It was almost at the boom now. The silence of the night, a silence that existed beneath the roar of the wind, stretched to its breaking point. The French sentries on the boom would be seeing the dark shape now. They might even be firing muskets at it, unaware that they were shooting at a stockpile of gunpowder large enough to blow a hole in the ocean. Cochrane checked his watch, shielding it from the spray. The hands moved with agonizing slowness. He looked at his men. They were exhausted, heaving at the oars, their eyes fixed on him, trusting him to deliver them from the furnace he had built. They were perhaps a few hundred yards away. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. But it was too late. The darkness shattered. It did not begin with a sound. It began with a light, a blinding, searing flash of white-hot energy that turned the night instantly into high noon. The sky was ripped open. For a split second, the entire Basque Roads, the French fleet, the islands, the distant British ships, and the terrified faces of the men in the gig were illuminated in ghastly, frozen clarity. Then came the shockwave. It hit the water first, flattening the waves, turning the sea into a sheet of trembling glass. Then it hit the gig. The boat was lifted bodily out of the water, tossed like a cork in a hurricane. The roar that followed was not a sound the human ear was designed to process. It was a physical blow, a concussion that rattled the teeth in their skulls and punched the air from their lungs. Above them, the sky was filled with a terrifying rain. The grenades and shells, ignited by the blast, were arching through the air, exploding like 1,000 thunderstorms condensed into a single moment. Burning timbers, some the size of trees, cartwheeled through the night, trailing tails of fire. The great boom, the mile-long chain of defense that the French had believed impenetrable, was gone. It had been vaporized, shattered. The shockwave had smashed it as a hammer smashes a chain of glass beads. In the gig, Cochrane shook the ringing from his head. He looked around. His men were dazed, cowering in the bottom of the boat, but they were alive. They had survived the edge of the apocalypse. He stood up in the rocking boat, steadying himself against the gunwale, and looked toward the enemy. The scene was one of absolute devastation. The explosion had done exactly what he had intended. It had not just destroyed the boom, it had injected pure, undiluted terror into the veins of the French Navy. Through the smoke and the falling debris, he could see the panic. The French ships were cutting their cables. In their desperation to escape the infernal machines, they were colliding with one another, drifting helplessly before the wind, driven by the gale onto the waiting rocks of the Paul's Shoal. The meticulous defensive line was broken. The sacred position was a ruin. The French fleet was helpless. Cochrane sat back down. His face was blackened with soot, his coat soaked with spray. He felt a grim, cold satisfaction. He had unlocked the door. He had done the impossible. He had served the enemy up on a platter. All that was left now was for the main fleet to come in and finish the job. All Gambia had to do was sail in and reap the harvest. "Return to the Imperieuse," Cochrane ordered, his voice hoarse. He did not know yet that the hardest part of the battle would not be fighting the French, but fighting the inertia of his own side. He had engineered the apocalypse, but he had forgotten that to a man like Lord Gambier, even the end of the world was an excuse to do nothing. The shockwave from the explosion vessel did not just travel through the air and the water. It traveled through the minds of 3,000 French sailors. In the history of naval warfare, battles are usually decided by the weight of iron thrown against oak. They are matters of ballistics, of wind gauges, of rate of fire. But the events that unfolded in the Basque Roads on the night of April 11, 1809, were not decided by physics. They were decided by psychology. Thomas Cochrane had understood a fundamental truth that his superiors in London had missed. You do not need to sink an enemy fleet to destroy it. You only need to convince them that they are already dead. As the echoes of the great blast rolled away into the night, a silence fell over the anchorage, a brief, breathless interlude between the thunder and the scream. And then the panic began. To the French captains on their quarterdecks, peering into the smoke-choked darkness, the world had become a nightmare. The explosion they had just witnessed was beyond their comprehension. It was not a conventional weapon, it was the wrath of God. And now, drifting out of the gloom behind the shockwave, came the rest of the British flotilla, the standard fire ships. These were not the sophisticated engineering marvels that Cochrane had piloted. They were crude, terrifying things, old transport hulks filled with tar, resin, and brushwood, set ablaze until they were towering pyramids of flame. Caught by the same gale that had driven the explosion vessel, they came surfing down the waves, crackling and roaring, illuminating the black water with a hellish, flickering orange light. To the French, whose nerves had just been shredded by the initial detonation, these approaching fires were not seen as ships. They were seen as more infernal machines. The cry went up from deck to deck, a contagion of pure terror that traveled faster than any signal flag. Les brûlots, les machines infernals, sauve qui peut. The fire ships, the infernal machines, save yourselves. Discipline, the iron spine of any navy, evaporated instantly. Admiral Lemond, on his flagship the Ocean, a massive three-decker of 120 guns, tried to maintain order, but the fear was primal. The captains of the French fleet looked at the approaching walls of fire, they looked at the shattered remnants of the boom, and they made a calculation that would doom them all. They believed that if they stayed at anchor, they would be incinerated. Their only hope, they reasoned, was to cut their cables and run deep into the channel, away from the British piers. It was a fatal error. It was exactly what Cochrane had gambled on. One by one, the axes fell. The heavy hemp anchor cables, thick as a man's thigh, were severed. Snap, snap, snap. As each cable parted, the ship attached to it was instantly seized by the gale and the ferocious tidal current. A sailing ship without an anchor in a narrow channel, in a storm, in the dark, is a runaway train. The scene that followed was a chaotic ballet of destruction. The French ships, now unmoored, began to drift helplessly downwind. They had no steerage way, their sails were furled, and there was no time to set them. They were simply massive, drifting blocks of wood and iron, careening blindly into the dark. The Ocean, the pride of the French Navy, swung wildly. As she drifted, she collided with the Patriot and the Tonnerre. The sound of the collision was horrific, the grinding of oak against oak, the snapping of spars, the screams of men crushed between the hulls. In the confusion, the Ocean's gunners, seeing a dark shape looming out of the smoke and assuming it was a British fire ship, opened fire. They poured a broadside into their own fleet. The Patriot and the Tonnerre returned fire. For a few minutes, the French were fighting a civil war in the middle of a storm, blasting away at their comrades, while the British fire ships drifted harmlessly past them. The fire ships, in truth, did very little physical damage. Most of them missed their targets, burning out on the shoals or drifting through the gaps in the French line, but they didn't need to hit anything. They were the sheepdogs, and the French ships were the panic-stricken flock. Driven by the wind and the tide, the French fleet was pushed inexorably toward the Paul's Shoal, a vast mudbank that acted as the graveyard of the anchorage. The Varsovie and the Aquilon, two powerful 74-gun ships, struck the mud first. They hit with a sickening crunch that shuddered through their frames. Then came the Calcutta, then the Tonnerre, then the Great Ocean. As the tide began to ebb, the water rushing out of the bay, the disaster was compounded. As the water level dropped, the grounded ships began to heel over. A ship is designed to float upright. When it sits on the mud and the water leaves it, it tips onto its side. Imagine the interior of those ships. As they listed over to 10, 20, 30 degrees, the chaos below decks became absolute. Heavy cannons broke loose from their tackles, sliding across the decks and crushing anything in their path. Shot lockers spilled thousands of iron balls that rolled like thunder through the bowels of the ships. Lanterns smashed, starting small fires. Men tumbled down the slanting decks, unable to stand. By 2:00 a.m., the fighting had stopped because there was no one left to fight. The wind still howled, but the battle was effectively over. The French fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force. They were not sunk, but they were castaways, 13 magnificent warships lying on their bilges in the mud, helpless as overturned beetles. From the deck of the Imperieuse, which had anchored safely near the entrance to the channel, Thomas Cochrane watched the glow of the dying fire ships. He was exhausted. His face was singed, his hands raw from the oars of the gig. But as he peered through his night glass, watching the distant, chaotic lights of the enemy drifting onto the shoals, he knew he had won. He had broken the line. He had achieved with a handful of powder and a few old hulks what the entire Channel Fleet had failed to do in years of blockade. He had neutralized the invasion threat. He paced the deck, waiting for the sun. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He knew what the dawn would bring. It would bring the kill. As the grey light of morning began to bleed into the eastern sky on April 12th, the full scale of the French disaster was revealed. It was a sight that no British sailor had ever seen before, and perhaps never would again. The sun rose over a graveyard. Stretched out across the Paul's Shoal, helplessly grounded, lay almost the entire French fleet. The Ossian, the Varsovie, the Aquilon, the Tonnerre, the Calcutta, ship after ship listing heavily, their copper bottoms exposed to the air. They were trapped. The tide was out, and they were stuck fast in the mud. They were sitting ducks. Their guns were pointing uselessly at the sky or buried in the mud. They could not maneuver. They could not fight. They were essentially massive, immobile targets waiting to be destroyed. Cochrane lowered his telescope. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the sheer magnitude of the opportunity. This was not just a victory, this was an annihilation. This was a chance to inflict a blow so severe that France would not recover for a generation. All the British fleet had to do was sail in. The channel was open. The boom was gone. The enemy was helpless. If Lord Gambier brought the fleet in now, they could burn every single one of them. They could capture the flagship. They could tow the Varsovie back to Portsmouth as a prize. It would be a victory to rival Trafalgar. It would be the end of the war at sea. Cochrane turned to the signal midshipman. "Hoist the signal," he ordered, his voice trembling with intensity. "Which signal, sir?" "Signal 1. The enemy ships are in a position to be attacked." The flags ran up the halyards of the Imperieuse, snapping in the morning breeze. Cochrane looked back toward the British fleet, anchored miles away in the deep water. He looked at the massive bulk of the Caledonia, Gambier's flagship. He waited for the answer. He waited to see the sails of the fleet unfurl, to see the great walls of canvas drop and fill with wind, to see the cavalry charge come thundering in to finish what he had started. He watched and he waited. But on the Caledonia, nothing moved. The sails remained furled. The anchor cable remained taut. Cochrane frowned. Perhaps they hadn't seen it. "Hoist another signal," he barked. "Signal, the enemy is half-wrecked. Destruction is certain." Still, the fleet did not move. A cold knot of dread began to form in Cochrane's stomach. It was a dread far worse than anything he had felt while sitting on the powder ship. He was looking at the greatest gift ever presented to a British admiral, and he was realizing, with a creeping horror, that the man he served might refuse to take it. The tide was beginning to turn. The water would soon return to the bay. If the British did not attack now, the French would refloat. They would warp themselves off the mud. They would escape. "Signal," Cochrane screamed, losing his composure. "Signal, the enemy is rising with the tide." Minutes dragged into hours. The sun climbed higher. The French crews, seeing that they were not being attacked, began to frantically lighten their ships, throwing guns and stores overboard to float them free. The opportunity was evaporating with every passing second. And still, Lord Gambier sat on his hands. This was the night of hell for the French, but as the morning wore on, it was becoming a different kind of hell for Thomas Cochrane. It was the hell of impotence. He had delivered the enemy bound and gagged, and now he had to watch as his own commander let them walk away. The battle against the French was over. The battle against the Admiralty was about to resume, and this time the weapons would not be fire ships, but signal flags and silence. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the wake of a wasted opportunity. It is a heavy, suffocating silence, filled not with peace, but with the ghosts of what might have been. On the morning of April 12, 1809, Thomas Cochrane stood on the quarterdeck of the Imperieuse and screamed into that silence. The signal flags above his head snapped in the wind, a desperate semaphore of frustration. Enemy grounded. Destruction certain. Half the fleet can destroy the enemy. The tide is rising. Each hoist was a plea, a logical argument, and a scream for help, all woven into colored wool. And each signal was met with the same maddening, indifferent stillness from the flagship Caledonia, anchored safely in the deep water 4 miles away. Admiral Lord Gambier had ordered the fleet to pipe to dinner. While the French were frantically jettisoning cannons and water casks to warp their ships off the mud, The British crews were eating boiled beef and biscuit. It was a juxtaposition so grotesque it bordered on farce. The greatest naval force on earth was watching its prey escape because its commander was checking the tide tables and finding them unfavorable. Cochrane watched the water level rise. He watched the French ship Varsovie heave and shudder as the buoyancy returned to her hull. He watched the Ocean, the massive three-decker flagship, begin to right herself. The night of hell had terrified the French, but the day of hesitation was giving them hope. They realized that the British Lion was not going to pounce. It was just going to watch. At 1:00 p.m., Cochrane could take it no longer. He realized that writing letters and hoisting flags was useless. Gambier would not move for logic, and he would not move for duty. He would only move for shame. Cochrane decided to force the Admiral's hand. He ordered the Imperieuse to weigh anchor. He did not attack with the wind. He did something far more theatrical and dangerous. He drifted his ship stern first toward the enemy line. By letting the ship drift with the tide, he kept his broadside facing the French, but more importantly, he controlled the speed of his approach. He was allowing himself to be sucked into the kill zone. He was one frigate of 38 guns. He was drifting into range of the Calcutta, 50 guns, the Varsovie, 80 guns, and the Aquilon, 74 guns. It was a mathematical impossibility. He was sailing a glass hammer against a stone wall. As the Imperieuse came within range, the French opened fire. The water around Cochrane's ship erupted in white geysers. Shot whistled through the rigging. Cochrane did not return fire immediately. He waited until the shot was pounding his hull, until the danger was undeniable and visible to the entire fleet watching from the distance. Then he hoisted a new signal. It was not a tactical suggestion. It was a distress call. In want of assistance. It was a lie, of course. Cochrane was not in distress. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He was mauling the Calcutta with a ferocity that stunned the French crew, but the signal was a masterstroke of political entrapment. By declaring he was in danger, he gave Gambier no choice. If the Admiral sat still while a British frigate was destroyed and a popular hero killed, he would be lynched by the London mob and court-martialed by the Admiralty. Gambier had to send help, not to destroy the French, but to save face. Reluctantly, grudgingly, the signal for assistance was acknowledged. Gambier detached a small squadron, the Indefatigable, the Emerald, the Unicorn, and the Pallas, to support the Imperieuse. It was too little, and it was hours too late, but it was enough to turn the tide of the immediate battle. As the British reinforcements came surging in, the Calcutta, already battered by Cochrane's guns, struck her colours. Her captain had fought bravely, but he was demoralized. He had seen the British fleet sitting outside and had assumed he was safe. The sudden, rabid aggression of Cochrane had broken his nerve. Next, the British turned their guns on the grounded Varsovie and Aquilon. These were powerful ships of the line, but they were leaning at awkward angles in the mud, unable to bring their guns to bear. The British frigates circled them like wolves around a wounded buffalo. They poured broadside after broadside into the exposed hulls. The carnage inside the French ships was horrific. By 5:30 p.m., both giants had surrendered. As dusk fell, the Basque Roads was illuminated once again, not by explosion vessels, but by the burning hulks of the captured ships. The British set fire to the Varsovie and the Aquilon. The flames licked up the masts, turning the night sky blood-red. But as Cochrane watched the flames, he felt no triumph. He felt a bitter, acidic rage. Because while the Varsovie and Aquilon burned, the real prize was slipping away. The Ocean, the great flagship, had refloated. Several other French ships had managed to warp themselves over the mud and were fleeing up the Charente River, moving deeper inland where the British ships could not follow. Cochrane frantically signaled for permission to pursue. He knew that if he could just press on, if he could just get a few more ships, he could catch them before they reached the safety of the river boom. He signaled that the enemy was fleeing. He signaled that they were disorganized. Gambier's response was to recall the fleet. He sent a signal ordering Cochrane to return to the flagship. Cochrane ignored it. He pretended he hadn't seen it in the smoke. He stayed at his post, firing his guns at the retreating shadows until the barrel of his chaser cannon was glowing hot. Gambier sent a letter explicitly ordering him to withdraw. "You have done your part so admirably," the letter read, dripping with condescending praise, "that I will not suffer you to tarnish it by venturing further." It was a command dressed as a compliment. Cochrane was being told to stop fighting because he had already won enough. But for Cochrane, there was no such thing as enough when the enemy was still afloat. He argued, he pleaded, he pointed out that the ocean was still vulnerable. But the rest of the British captains, bound by the iron discipline of the Navy, obeyed the recall. One by one, the Indefatigable, the Pallas, and the others turned their bows and sailed back to the outer anchorage. Cochrane was left alone, again. He stayed in the inner roads for another day, trying to effect repairs and destroy what little he could, but the moment had passed. The tide had turned, both literally and metaphorically. The French had escaped. When Cochrane finally returned to the Caledonia, the atmosphere was poisonous. He did not look like a man who had just destroyed 4 enemy capital ships and broken a blockade. He looked like a man who had attended a funeral. He walked into Gambia's cabin, still wearing his smoke-stained uniform, and the confrontation that followed was the true end of his naval career. Gambia was pleased. He was writing his dispatch to the Admiralty, framing the battle as a glorious victory, a testament to his own prudent leadership. He expected Cochrane to be grateful. He expected the young captain to shake his hand and accept his share of the glory. Instead, Cochrane told him the truth. He told Gambia that the escape of the French fleet was a disgrace. He told him that the caution of the commander-in-chief had robbed Britain of a total victory. He told him that he would not be silent. "My lord," Cochrane said, his voice trembling with controlled fury, "I shall oppose the vote of thanks." The vote of thanks was the standard parliamentary procedure following a naval victory. It was a formality, a rubber stamp of approval that unlocked promotions and rewards for the commanders. For a serving officer to threaten to oppose it in the House of Commons was unheard of. It was mutiny by political means. It was a declaration of war against the Admiralty itself. Gambia stared at him, his face draining of color. He realized then that the Sea Wolf was not just dangerous to the French. He was a bomb that had been brought on board the ship of state, and the fuse was burning. Cochrane walked out of the cabin. He had won the Battle of the Basque Roads, but he had lost the war for his survival. He had humiliated his superior. He had exposed the incompetence of the system. And the system, like the great crushing hull of a man-of-war, was about to roll over him. The signal had been ignored, the victory had been betrayed, and now the punishment would begin. War is a bloody business, but politics is a dirty one. When Thomas Cochrane stepped off the Imperieuse and onto the cobbled streets of Portsmouth in the summer of 1809, he believed he was entering a battle of truth against falsehood. He believed that if he simply presented the facts, the depth of the water, the position of the enemy, the time of the tide, justice would prevail. He was a scientist of war, and to him, the evidence was irrefutable. Lord Gambier had failed to attack a helpless enemy. Therefore, Lord Gambier was negligent. But Thomas Cochrane was naive. He had spent so much time fighting the French that he had forgotten how the British establishment fought. They did not use cannonballs, they used procedure. They did not use boarding parties, they used committees. And they did not aim to kill the body, they aimed to kill the reputation. The court-martial of Lord Gambier was ostensibly a trial to determine if the Admiral had failed in his duty. In reality, it was a show trial designed to destroy the accuser. The Admiralty could not afford to have a popular, radical member of Parliament proving that their chosen commander-in-chief was an incompetent coward. It would bring down the government. The narrative had to be controlled. The hero had to become the villain. The trial took place on board the HMS Gladiator in Portsmouth Harbour. The courtroom was packed with the gold braid of the naval elite. The judges were admirals, men who had dined with Gambier, men who shared his politics, men who understood that the stability of the Navy depended on maintaining the hierarchy. To them, Cochrane was not a whistleblower, he was a mutineer in a captain's coat. From the moment the proceedings began, the fix was in. The prosecution was lackluster, asking soft questions that allowed Gambier to pontificate on his prudence and his responsibility to the fleet. But the true weapon of the defense was not rhetoric, it was cartography. Central to Cochrane's accusation was the fact that the channel leading to the French fleet was deep enough for British ships of the line to enter. He knew this because he had sounded it himself. He had sailed it. He had lived in it for days. But when the defense presented their evidence, they produced charts of the Basque Roads. These charts were masterpieces of fiction. The Admiralty had commissioned new charts specifically for the trial. On these parchments, the wide, deep channel that Cochrane had used was shrunk. The shoals were expanded. Rocks appeared where deep water existed. The narrow neck of the channel, which was actually a mile wide, was depicted as a treacherous needle's eye. It was a geographical lie, drafted in ink, intended to prove that any attack would have been suicidal. Cochrane watched in disbelief as the judges nodded sagely over these fabrications. He tried to intervene. He tried to point out that the French flagship, the massive Océan, had sailed through that very water. If a French three-decker could float there, surely a British one could too. His logic was ignored. The court was not interested in hydrography, it was interested in acquittal. Then came the witnesses. One by one, the captains of the fleet were called to the stand. These were men who had seen the French ships helpless on the mud. In the wardrooms, they had whispered their frustration at Gambier's delay. But here, under the stern gaze of the Admiralty Board, their courage failed them. They knew that to support Cochrane was to end their own careers. They gave vague, evasive answers. They spoke of uncertain winds and great risks. They protected the tribe. Cochrane stood alone. He was the accuser, yet he was treated like the defendant. He was painted as rash, inexperienced, and insubordinate. His brilliance at the Basque Roads was reframed as recklessness. His destruction of the boom was minimized. The man who had engineered the apocalypse was dismissed as a pyromaniac who didn't understand the bigger picture of naval strategy. When the verdict was finally read, it was not a surprise, but it was a shock to the conscience. The court found that Lord Gambier's conduct had been marked by zeal, judgment, and ability. He was most honorably acquitted. The gavel came down, and with it, the guillotine on Thomas Cochrane's naval career. By clearing Gambier, the court had implicitly convicted Cochrane of lying. If Gambier was a hero, then Cochrane was a slanderer. The establishment closed ranks. The Admiralty refused to offer him another command. The Imperieuse was given to another captain. The plans he had drawn up for new frigates, for steamships, for gas warfare, all were shelved. He was 34 years old. He was the most talented sailor Britain had produced in a generation, and he was finished. He left the Gladiator not as the sea wolf, but as a political pariah. He had learned a bitter lesson. In the Royal Navy, it was better to lose a battle while following the rules than to win one by breaking them. The French had not been able to defeat him. The Spanish had not been able to catch him, but a room full of old men with quill pens had sunk him without firing a shot. Cochrane returned to London, his heart hardening into a stone. If they would not let him fight at sea, he would fight them on land. He threw himself into radical politics with a renewed, almost manic ferocity. He attacked the corruption of the government with the same venom he had used against the El Gamo. He became a danger to the state. And so the state decided that professional ruin was not enough. They needed to take his freedom. They needed to make him a criminal. The court-martial was just the dress rehearsal. The main event, the trial that would strip him of his name and his honor, was yet to come. London in the winter of 1814 was a city living on its nerves. The war against Napoleon had dragged on for 2 decades, bleeding the treasury dry and filling the streets with maimed veterans. The stock exchange was less a financial institution and more a casino, where fortunes rose and fell on the whisper of a rumor from the continent. Every man with a guinea to his name was gambling on the outcome of the war. If Napoleon fell, government stocks, known as omnium, would skyrocket. If he survived, they would plummet. It was an atmosphere of hysteria, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. On the morning of February 21st, that spark arrived in the form of a man in a scarlet uniform. He appeared first at the ship inn in Dover, calling himself Colonel de Bourgh. He was wet, exhausted, and seemingly delirious with joy. He claimed to have just arrived from France with momentous news: Napoleon Bonaparte was dead. The tyrant had been killed by Cossacks, he shouted, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Peace was at hand. The news travelled to London with the speed of a contagion. The telegraph system, the semaphore towers that relayed messages from the coast to the Admiralty, was obscured by fog, so the rumour spread by word of mouth, growing more elaborate with every mile. By the time the stock exchange opened, the city was in a frenzy. The price of omnium stocks began to climb vertically. Greed replaced caution. Men bought and bought, terrified of missing out on the peace dividend. And in the midst of this chaotic buying spree, a few people were quietly selling. They were offloading massive amounts of stock at the very peak of the market, making thousands of pounds in a matter of hours. Among those sellers was the uncle of Thomas Cochrane, and the man in the scarlet coat, the impostor Colonel de Bourgh, was not a messenger of peace. He was a fraudster named Charles de Beringer. And where did this fraudster go after spreading his lies? He went straight to number 13 Green Street, Mayfair, the home of Lord Thomas Cochrane. The great stock exchange fraud was a clumsy, theatrical hoax that should have been a footnote in history. Instead, it became the weapon that the British establishment used to finally execute the reputation of the Sea Wolf. The facts of the case remain murky to this day. Cochrane admitted that de Beringer had come to his house, but he claimed the man arrived claiming to be a distressed army officer in debt, begging for a change of clothes to escape his creditors. Cochrane, ever the soft touch for a soldier in trouble, gave him a hat and a coat. He swore he knew nothing of the stock market plot. He swore he was innocent. But the government did not care about the truth. They cared about the opportunity. Here was the radical MP, the man who had accused the Admiralty of incompetence, caught in a web of deceit. The investigation was swift and brutal. The Committee of the Stock Exchange, furious at being duped, linked the impostor to Cochrane. The political sharks smelled blood. The trial was held in June at the Guildhall. Presiding over the case was Lord Ellenborough, the Lord Chief Justice. If Cochrane was looking for a fair trial, he had come to the wrong place. Ellenborough was a staunch Tory, a member of the cabinet, and a man who despised Cochrane's radical politics. He did not act as a judge, he acted as a prosecutor. From the opening statements, Ellenborough bullied the defense witnesses. He refused to adjourn the trial when the defense counsel was exhausted, forcing them to present their case late into the night. When he summed up the evidence for the jury, he did not ask them to weigh the facts. He essentially instructed them to convict. He posed the question, why would a man involved in a criminal fraud go to Cochrane's house unless Cochrane was an accomplice? He dismissed Cochrane's explanation of the charity change of clothes as a fabrication. The jury, hand-picked and intimidated by the terrifying Chief Justice, returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence passed down by Ellenborough was a savage act of vengeance. Cochrane was fined £1,000. He was sentenced to 12 months in the King's Bench prison, but the final part of the sentence was so medieval, so explicitly designed to degrade, that it shocked the entire nation. Lord Cochrane, the hero of the Basque Roads, the heir to the earldom of Dundonald, was sentenced to stand in the pillory. The pillory was a punishment reserved for perjurers, sodomites, and the lowest criminals. It involved a man being locked by his neck and wrists in a wooden frame in a public square, where the mob would pelt him with rotten vegetables, dead cats, and filth. To sentence a naval hero and a lord to such a fate was unheard of. It was an attempt to socially murder him. But in their malice, the government had miscalculated the mood of the people. The public did not see Cochrane as a fraudster, they saw him as a martyr. When the sentence was announced, the mood in London turned ugly. There were whispers of riots. The electors of Westminster, whom Cochrane represented in Parliament, declared that if their member was put in the pillory, they would tear the pillory down and stone the government ministers instead. Terrified of a revolution, the government backed down. They remitted the pillory sentence, but they proceeded with the rest of the degradation. Cochrane was expelled from the House of Commons. He was struck off the Navy list, his career erased. And then came the final indignity, the scene we witnessed at the very beginning of this story. The order was given to strip him of his knighthood. The King of Arms was dispatched to Westminster Abbey to kick his banner down the steps. In 1814, Thomas Cochrane entered the King's Bench prison. The walls were high, the air was dank, and the company was desperate. He was no longer Captain Cochrane. He was prisoner 253. The psychological toll was immense. Here was a man who had roamed the oceans of the world, a man whose spirit was defined by boundless horizons and the freedom of the wind. Now, his world was reduced to a 12 by 12 cell. He was surrounded by debtors and vagrants. The Admiralty had won. They had taken the wolf and put him in a cage. He spent his days in that cell inventing. He designed a new type of rotary steam engine. He drew up plans for street lighting. His mind, unable to find an outlet in war, turned inward to mechanics. But underneath the activity, there was a deep, burning coal of resentment. He refused to pay the fine. He said he would only pay it under duress. When the government finally forced him to pay to secure his release, he endorsed the banknote with a message: "My health having suffered by long and close confinement, and my oppressors being resolved to deprive me of property or life, I submit to robbery to protect myself from murder." He walked out of prison a broken man in the eyes of the law, but a dangerous man in the eyes of history. He was penniless. His reputation was in tatters. He was a beggar in his own country. Most men would have vanished into obscurity. They would have retired to a quiet cottage and drunk themselves to death. But Thomas Cochrane was not most men. As he stood outside the prison gates, breathing the free air of London, he looked at the country that had betrayed him. He had no ship. He had no rank. He had no king to serve. But across the Atlantic, a continent was burning. The colonies of South America were rising up against the Spanish Empire. They had passion, they had courage, but they had no navy. They needed a leader. They needed a genius. They needed a sea wolf. The Admiralty thought they had finished him. They thought they had buried him, but they had merely set him free to become a legend on a global scale. The beggar was about to become an admiral again, but this time he would fly the flag of liberty. When Thomas Cochrane walked out of the King's Bench prison in 1815, he was 40 years old. In the eyes of the British establishment, his life was over. He was a convicted fraudster, a disgraced officer, and a political untouchable. The narrative of his life should have ended there, a tragic cautionary tale whispered in the wardrooms of the fleet as a warning to young midshipmen: do not challenge the system. But Thomas Cochrane did not operate by the narrative logic of ordinary men. If Britain would not have him, he would find a nation that would. He accepted an invitation from the rebels of Chile, a colony fighting a desperate war for independence against the Spanish Empire. He arrived in Valparaiso in 1818, not as a beggar, but as a savior. The Chileans made him their vice-admiral. They gave him command of their navy, a collection of converted merchantmen and rotting frigates that looked pitiful against the might of Spain. It was the Speedy scenario all over again, but on a continental scale. Cochrane immediately instilled the British touch into his motley crew of Chilean peasants and foreign mercenaries. He did not wait for the Spanish to attack. He hunted them. In 1820, he performed a feat of arms that rivaled the Basque Roads in its insanity. He decided to capture the fortress city of Valdivia. Valdivia was known as the Gibraltar of the South. It was defended by 9 separate forts, over 100 cannons, and a deep water moat. It was considered impregnable. Cochrane attacked it with 2 small ships and 300 men. He landed his troops at night, leading them through the surf. But this time he was not just a sailor, he was a general. He marched his men through the jungle, attacking the forts from the landward side where they were weakest. One by one, the Spanish strongholds fell in the darkness, the defenders terrified by the sudden appearance of these demons who seemed to materialize out of the mist. By dawn, the flag of independent Chile flew over the citadel. Cochrane had secured the independence of a nation in a single night. From Chile, he moved to Brazil, taking command of their fledgling navy in their war against Portugal. Once again, the odds were laughable. He faced a Portuguese fleet of over 60 vessels with a single flagship. Yet through a campaign of psychological terror, bluff, and relentless pursuit, he chased the Portuguese navy all the way back to Lisbon. At the port of Maranhão, he sailed in alone and convinced the garrison that a massive invasion fleet was just over the horizon. The city surrendered to a bluff. He became known as El Diablo, the Devil. To the people of South America, he was the sea wolf, the breaker of chains. He was the Garibaldi of the ocean, a mercenary of liberty who toppled empires with nothing but his reputation and his nerve. But despite the adulation of spiraling continents, despite the titles of First Admiral and the estates gifted to him in the rainforests of Brazil, Cochrane's heart remained in the grey, damp island that had rejected him. He was a Scot, he was a British sailor, and the wound of 1814, the kicking of his banner, the stripping of his knighthood, refused to heal. He returned to Europe in the late 1820s, lending his sword briefly to the Greek War of Independence, but his eyes were fixed on London. He began a new campaign, not of war but of petition. He wrote to the king, he wrote to the Admiralty. He did not ask for mercy, he demanded justice. He had to wait a long time. The generation of old corruption, the men like Lord St. Vincent and Lord Ellenborough, had to die out first. The bitterness had to fade. Slowly the tide turned. In 1832, King William IV, the Sailor King, granted Cochrane a free pardon. It was a legal fiction, forgiving him for a crime he hadn't committed, but it allowed him to be reinstated in the Royal Navy list. The wolf was back in the fold. But the full restoration, the complete cleansing of his name, fell to a young Queen Victoria. She looked at the old man, now the 10th Earl of Dundonald, white-haired, frail, but still possessing that intense, hawk-like gaze, and she saw a legend. She saw the last living link to the age of Nelson. In 1847, the final piece of the puzzle was put back in place. The Order of the Bath was restored to him. One can only imagine the scene in Westminster Abbey when the banner of Thomas Cochrane was raised once again. 33 years earlier, it had been kicked through the dust of the chapel floor. Now, it was hoisted back to its rightful place among the knights of the realm. The officials who had defiled it were dead and forgotten. The man they had tried to destroy stood beneath it, vindicated. He had outlived his enemies. He had outlasted the conspiracy. Thomas Cochrane died in 1860 at the age of 84. He was given a state funeral. He was buried in the nave of Westminster Abbey, the very building that had been the scene of his greatest humiliation. The pallbearers included the greatest admirals of the Victorian age, men who had grown up reading stories of the Speedy and the Imperieuse. As we look back at the life of the admiral who fought 40 battles and died a beggar, beggared not of money in the end, but of the years he should have given to his own country, we are left with a profound sense of what if. What if Cochrane had led the British fleet in the War of 1812 against the Americans? What if the Admiralty had embraced his plans for steamships and screw propellers decades earlier? Cochrane was an inventor as much as a warrior. He patented the first caisson for digging tunnels under the Thames. He proposed the use of smoke screens and saturation bombardment, tactics that would not be fully utilized until the First World War. He was a man of the 20th century, trapped in the 18th. His legacy is not just written in the history books, it is written in our culture. If his exploits sound like fiction, it is because they became fiction. The novelist Captain Marryat served under him. Patrick O'Brian used him as the template for Jack Aubrey in the Master and Commander series. The fictional heroes we adore are merely pale reflections of the real Thomas Cochrane. But the true legacy of the Sea Wolf is found in the lesson of his life. He taught the world that the impossible is merely an equation waiting to be solved. He showed that one man, armed with imagination and courage, can shatter the complacency of the powerful. He was a difficult man. He was arrogant, prickly, and litigious. He was not a safe pair of hands. But when the world was ablaze, when the odds were insurmountable, and when the empire needed a miracle, Thomas Cochrane was the man you wanted on the quarterdeck. He died a hero, his banner flying high in the Abbey. But let us remember him not as the old earl in the velvet robes, but as the young captain on the deck of the Speedy, face blackened with soot, pockets full of cannonballs, sailing into the teeth of a giant, proving that in the end, it is not the size of the ship that matters, but the size of the heart within it.